So this morning's topic is not necessarily always a rip from the headline, although there is a recent headline we'll be covering. The sources are linked in the chat. Is vegan kosher? It could be a very easy answer. Look for the kosher certification and you'll know whether something is kosher or not. That's always a safe way to know whether something is kosher. The second famous Ask Your Rabbi, I think I may have mentioned before, one of the most common questions, I guess, is this certification acceptable? Or is this kosher? And there's sometimes a difference between kosher and communally acceptable or widely acceptable. And so in general, kosher is pretty clear. If it meets the rules of kosher, it's kosher. And so usually, where do we turn to know if something meets the rules of kosher? These days, you look at the label. If it has a kosher certification, it's kosher. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But what if it's somewhere in between? And how do we analyze those types of situations, especially with the growth of the kosher industry and the proliferation of different types of supervisions? In some ways, this is taking us back to where things started out. Once upon a time, there were no central kosher organizations, and people, there would be individual rabbis who would certify, or people would self-certify by looking at the ingredients. We're not so far removed from that type of a reality. About 100 years ago is when the OU started the first national kosher supervision and certification. Actually started with the Heinz Company in Pittsburgh, and the rest, as they say, is history. But here, with regard to vegan, you start wondering, well, if there's a certain definition of vegan and certain products and ingredients are excluded from vegan, maybe that can provide more assurances that things are kosher. The same thing with vegetarian. Some people take the same approach with dairy, right? People who keep kosher or try to keep kosher, they say, well, look, I don't eat meat out, but I'll eat dairy out, or I'll eat fish out. And this is not something that we endorse as a community standard. We want people to feel comfortable with the community standard. So we wouldn't bring kosher, we wouldn't bring salmon from any restaurant under the sun into a shul event or the like. We want things to be done, as we say, kedas v'kedin, according to Jewish law, to make sure things are covered. Once you start talking about, for example, that there's certain products excluded, like with vegetarian, there's no meat or chicken, or vegan, where there's a whole host of other ingredients that animal products, that things that don't go into this into the preparation, then we should have more assurances. And so I would say, from a sociological perspective, even people who are more careful about keeping kosher, certainly when it comes to meat and when it comes to dairy, when it comes to vegan or quote unquote just a salad, but that's not our topic today, we'll take more liberties, because go back to self-certify. You investigate, you see what it is, what could the problems be, you analyze it, and the like. But you see in source number one, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article headline from the conservative movement: OK's vegetarian and vegan restaurants without kosher supervision. So obviously this is not going to be something that is accepted in the Orthodox community. It's not something that meets the threshold of the assurances that something is kosher, but it does raise some issues, because how are we to understand this statement, this development, and how does that play into what is the reality of many people doing it? Now, I think we've talked before about how the conservative movement views itself as a historical movement when it comes to Jewish law. They feel that Judaism is bound by halacha, but halacha can change throughout history based on historical circumstances that can push the Jewish community and the halachic understanding away from some of the more previously accepted approaches, and history can change that to the less accepted approaches. The most famous example, and really what got them off and running, was the driving on Shabbos to shul. Right? But of course, they started permitted driving on Shabbos to shul, and then everyone drives on Shabbos, period. And there have other major changes, and another major shift is their approach to egalitarianism, counting women in a minyan. Right? These are areas that, as I've described, usually the way Orthodoxy has the halakhic system is closed with the Talmud. If it's in the Talmud, we're never going to change it. Talmud says 10 men make a minyan, we're never going to change that. there is flexibility, and there is dealing with new realities. And we've talked about a number of those situations previously. But it is interesting the way to just look at the issues that the conservative movement, the conservative, their committee on Jewish law and standards, the topics that they bring up, as well as how that is, how that plays with the sources, some of the sources they utilize. Because we're not talking about people who are just saying, we think this is okay. They're trying to rely upon sources, as well as just the whole idea of when halakhic topics are raised in public and make their way into the public sphere, especially when things are different. This is one where it's a halakhic subject, kashrus being raised publicly by a movement that's not bound by the regularly accepted halacha. It puts itself out there in some ways. And I think, just looking around, the reaction to this in the Orthodox community was muted. Of course they're going to do that. They're not bound. They're not halakhic anyway. They're not bound by halacha anyway. We would never endorse this type of an approach. Doesn't matter what our people may be deciding on their own, but let's face it, this is not acceptable because the reasoning that they invoke, and we'll see some of that in a minute, is not the reasoning that's accepted in the broader halakhic Orthodox community. And there's just another topic that came up recently with regard to halacha that played out in a smaller segment of the Jewish community. It had to do with the laws of mourning and how to treat a situation where someone who is sitting Shiva was viewed as essential to a large public gathering celebration event. And the discussion was whether this individual can attend during Shiva. Usually during Shiva, we don't go to events. We don't participate. You're sitting Shiva for the week. And how this issue played out as well. And this took place in the yeshivish community. So just this idea in terms of how halachic issues play out and how they are received, and sometimes whether these pronouncements pass without any type of reaction or response, or when do more disagreements break out? So let's go to the news. Let's see what happened. Source number one. For years, a subset of Jews who eat only at kosher certified restaurants have bent the rules by taking advantage of a growing trend, fully vegan eateries. Now, a ruling by the conservative movement has given that practice its official imprimatur, declaring that Jews may eat at vegetarian or vegan restaurants that don't have kosher supervision. In practice, the ruling's target audience is small. Right? Most Jews who eat only in certified kosher restaurants are Orthodox and pay little attention to conservative opinions on Jewish law. According to a 2020 survey by Pew, 17% of Jews identify as conservative, and only a fraction keep kosher at home. So the conservative movement's legal pronouncement only affects the small number of Jews who are bound by the conservative movement's legal policies. Right? Most people who identify as conservative Jews aren't living according to the conservative Judaism's approach. They're just affiliating that way. And they say kind of the conservative synagogues, most of the Jews who attend are Reform because they're not following halacha in any sense of the word. Even fewer adhere to the strict dietary laws when they dine out, but the ruling does represent a change in how the conservative movement approaches one of the core elements of traditional Jewish life. It comes as an increasing number of Americans are going meatless, and amid a broader reckoning over what counts as kosher now that products such as Beyond Meat and Impossible Pork, which are plant-based and contain no animal products, are available in grocery stores. Previously, the movement deemed that conservative Jews who keep kosher should eat only at restaurants under kosher supervision. But the 38-page ruling issued earlier this month says that without any meat products, many of the concerns surrounding kosher observance are rendered moot. The decision was voted on by 20 of the 25 members, the vast majority of whom voted in favor. Right? They have the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. They have to have a majority rule, and this was overwhelming majority endorsed this. Without meat, there can be no mixing of meat and milk, the ruling says. And there's also no possibility of eating non-kosher foods such as pork. Even though the vast majority of kosher supervisors say cheese needs certification, the ruling permits eating at vegetarian restaurants on the grounds of a prior conservative ruling stating that animal rennet is not prohibited. The ruling is explicit that it does not apply to restaurants that serve meat or fish, but otherwise have vegetarian options because there's still a risk of cross-contamination on non-kosher foods. So the idea is if it's a vegetarian restaurant that has dairy options, or if it's a completely vegan restaurant, actually the article says that some people may want to be machmir and only apply this reasoning to vegan restaurants and not vegetarian because they don't want to be so lenient with regards to dairy. But they address both of those types of restaurants. But if there's a possibility of cross-contamination with any type of meat, or fish, because fish also is an issue in terms of if it's kosher fish or not, problematic, but only vegetarian and vegan, fully vegetarian vegan restaurants. The requirement to eat only kosher is not one of health or physical purity, but one of godliness and the observance of mitzvot, the ruling concludes. While there's some levels of risk which the halacha prohibits undertaking, we have argued that eating in an unsupervised vegan or vegetarian restaurant, where government oversight exists and restaurants are generally concerned with their reputations, does not overstep that boundary. Documents prohibiting prohibitions on the consumption of bread baked by non-Jews were instituted primarily to prohibit social interaction with non-Jews. So we have to unpack some of the issues that they're dealing with. One has to do with is being cooked by a non-Jew. The other has to do with in terms of being able to trust the proprietors, right? Because usually what's the whole purpose of hashgacha, of supervision, is to ensure that all the right ingredients are being used. They seem to be waiving that requirement. And so they're waiving that issue. They're waiving the issue of food cooked by non-Jews. They've also waived the dairy issue by relying on saying that the rennet is not problematic. Those are a couple of the issues that needs to be unpacked. But first, any questions?
And also the turning on of the fire as
so remember that's all bishul akum. Meaning it could be that the restaurants we eat in are not really appropriate because of the fact that those restaurants they rely on a lower level of cooking done by the Jew.
And they may not have been turning on the fire at the Jews, you mean, in other words, in those places.
Right, but many opinions, we'll see. Sephardic opinions, that's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, we're going to be looking at from a halachic perspective. We're going to look at some of the sources relating to their waiving away the issue of non-supervised cheese, the whole issue of bishul akum in terms of what is cooked by a non-Jew. Also, this idea that they make very explicit that we're not worried about fraternization anymore, and a lot of the problems with non-Jews cooking for Jews had to do with fraternization. Well, is that really a problem in a restaurant? Is that a problem at a home when the housekeeper does the cooking? And we'll also have to. They're also waving aside that any possible problems can be nullified. Right. This is also something that happens in a kosher kitchen. Like you accidentally mix up something, maybe the food is still kosher because not enough of a cross-contamination took effect, and they're kind of essentially waving away any possible issues as those that don't need to be that don't rise to the level of concern. Right. They've argued that there's some levels of risk halacha prohibits undertaking. Those are not the types of risks that they're going to say are problematic in this case. So any questions on just the presentation of the article before we dive into some of the halachic issues? It has to be said, obviously, this is not something that is endorsed or is even appropriate. There are significant halachic issues if there's no certification, no supervision. One of the things which it does exist is that there are many vegan restaurants, certainly in the metro New York area, that have supervision that won't necessarily appear on community kosher lists. Some congregations have that, or the food that's prepared in these restaurants won't be brought in for a congregational kiddush or the like. And that has to do with the different levels of supervision, right? There are certain places that have, there are certain restaurants, there are certain supervisions that are giving supervision to establishments that have some very obvious issues. So for example, if you have a meat restaurant opened on Shabbos that has a supervision, how is that to be understood? Now, there are rabbis who will explain it. The rabbis have explanations for this, and we can maybe veer into that after we cover the issues presented here. But many are skeptical of such types of supervision if you have a meat restaurant open on Shabbos, because the likelihood is there's no mashgiach working there that day. Now, how does the supervising rabbi or supervising agency answer for that? You could ask them, or we can talk about it once we're done. But the idea of there are plenty of restaurants that have a kosher supervision that may not be as widely recognized or fully endorsed. But vegan restaurants might be much easier and more simple to give supervision to. And I think that the reality is in the metro area that there are dozens of such vegan restaurants that have supervision by different authorities, not national authorities, not OU, OK, HUFK, and the like for the most part, because part of this is financial. They will require a higher level of supervision, comes with a higher cost because they're going to provide access to more potential customers. That doesn't mean that the supervisions that are less widely accepted, that doesn't make it non-kosher, but the question has to be asked. But I'm raising that to point out that vegan restaurants, there are many, many more vegan restaurants that have kosher supervision, even if it's not as fully recognized. We're not talking about that. We're just addressing what there's no supervision, because that's what this article is trying to say. You don't need supervision at all when it comes to vegetarian or vegan. I'll just also point out that when reading through the discussion, the arguments, they are more compelling from a social reality perspective than they are from a halachic perspective. Right? It's almost written with the conclusion in mind that some of these issues don't really apply the same way, and so therefore we're going to not be as concerned by them, even if for the most part halacha has been concerned by them. So let's go to the videotape. So one of the things that they talk about is that the dairy in a vegetarian restaurant is not problematic. And that comes from the idea that the way cheese is manufactured today, most cheeses are manufactured with vegetarian or microbial rennet. Those that are that's not really officially cheese according to Jewish law. However, there is also a halacha that any dairy cheese that is produced requires rabbinic supervision. That's a disputable topic in Jewish law from different kosher agencies. For the most part, it's become more accepted to be more careful, and we'll see some of the rationale for that a little bit later. But there are those, and this has been used, some very famous products on the kosher cheese shelves. Here too, rise to level. There's certain types of cheese that are kosher certified, but not generally widely utilized. You don't see them in some of the kosher supermarkets. Part of that is this debate. Does there have to be Jewish supervision on cheese if it's not halachically cheese? Right? It's made by vegetarian, rennet, or microbial, and the like. So clearly this is, this discussion here that says vegetarian restaurants, even if they serve dairy, don't require supervision, is taking the lenient approach to that. It's also taking a lenient approach to that even if the cheese is made by real rennet, that's not a problem. And this was raised by a conservative rabbi named Isaac Klein in an article on kashrut. Source number 2, the rennet used today cannot be considered forbidden because, first of all, most of it is derived from dried up skins that have become like a piece of wood. In addition, the extraction has brought about the use of strong chemicals and acids, which remove the substance from the status of food fit even for a dog. And third, the rennet goes through a number of chemical changes that transform it into a new substance. Finally, the rennet is not put into the milk in a pure form, but is diluted with other substances, so it is batel b'shishim, annulled in 60 times its bulk. So this approach to rennet is making a couple of claims, some of which are endorsed by Orthodox rabbis. The idea that this is product which is coming from the skin of an animal, the lining of a stomach, and is processed, they call it dry as a tree, and it's not edible anymore. This is something that is raised and discussed by Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grzinski. Chaim Ozer Grzinski was the rabbi in Vilna pre-World War II, and he talks about, it's source number 3, Pashut atzmo yavshu ein behem chashash iser klal. If you're talking about things inside the animal that are completely dry, there's no prohibition whatsoever. He talks about, raises an analogy with regards to the feet of bees, because they talk, you can't get honey without feet of the bees coming into it. I'm sorry if that grosses people out, but it's the reality. You're not necessarily going to see them; they strain them, but it enters into it. It stays there for a long time. But halacha says it's not a problem because there's no. It's just part of the process. It's just it's not really considered something that's edible on its own. It's mixed in. It's part of the process, and it's something that we ignore and does not negate the kosher status of the honey. So he points out that the rabbi who wrote to him was talking about this type of rennet. It's a similar argument that's made with gelatin. And he says, I agree that it's not a problem to permit these products that are used in the creation of the gelatin or the cheese, that you can eat these products. So that, some people may remember the status of gelatin and marshmallows. You go back 40 years, what they were selling in the thing. And then there's a whole brand, the Joyva brand of chocolate. Now I think more and more of it is under the Chav K and doesn't use non-kosher gelatin, but this is an issue that has been discussed for generations. So you go back 90 years, 100 years, and it was endorsed by one of the leading rabbis of Vilna, And over time, especially as alternate products became available, the opposition, the disagreement with this psak grew. But that is one of the areas that you could apply to cheese. And I mean, people always talk about, they remember back in the 40s, people would eat Velveeta singles, and American cheese is not really cheese; it's a cheese product if you look at the label. But a lot of that is based on the fact that either you can be lenient if it's not real rennet, and even if it is real rennet, you can also find leniency the same way you can in gelatin. So therefore, you've kind of wiped away halakhic concerns of non-kosher cheese and non-kosher dairy in a vegetarian restaurant. Right? So there's something to be said, but it's holding on to a path of Jewish law that is not generally accepted. Questions on the cheese dairy front? Okay. So then they, as Rosie mentioned before, this idea of the non-Jewish cooking, the bishul akum. So where does this come from? So the Mishnah of Avodah Zarah raises this issue. These are items that belong to Gentiles and are prohibited, but their prohibition is not that of an item from which deriving benefit is prohibited. So if the Gentile makes these products, you can't eat them, but you're allowed to sell them. You're allowed to do business in them. They're not in and of themselves prohibited products like milk that was milked by a Gentile and a Jew did not see him performing the action, and their bread and their oil. Mishnah notes Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in his court permitted the oil of Gentiles entirely. And that's so we see that oil seemed to get taken off the list. Then they talk about boiled and pickled vegetables, whose usual preparation involves adding wines and vinegars, other types of fish and brine, with types of fish that we don't have translations for, but were common back then. All of these are prohibited, but their prohibition is not that of an item which is derived from deriving benefit is prohibited, right? These are not inherently prohibited items. They're just items that were prepared by the Gentile. And the Talmud on this Mishnah, source 5, says, why? Intermarriage. We're worried about the fraternization with the enemy, right? It doesn't say it's not a religious reason. It's really about a communal stringency to ensure that Jews remain Jewish. And so, this idea of bishul akum, and so the bread is called pas akum. These are things which are prohibited without Jewish involvement. And so the question is, what kind of Jewish involvement or Jewish oversight? Also, here the Talmud does mention the reason that is due to intermarriage on these products. Well, what happens when intermarriage is not an issue? Can that be ensured or guaranteed? It's very interesting that the article that's raising this issue, permitting these restaurants, points out that we have a lot of intermarriage today. Right, it's a reality, especially in the non-Orthodox community. We're talking, 60% and up. The article recognizes that, but also tries to point out that that's not happening because you're eating in the non-kosher restaurants. The problem with intermarriage is a much bigger one than the restaurants people are eating in. We could push back and say, well, you may as well start somewhere. But here, so how do we unpack, what's prohibited, how it's prepared, where it's eaten? Is there ever not a concern of intermarriage? So when the Shulchan Aruch mentions this halacha, we're going to look at a couple of possibilities here. One is, what about a housekeeper? Right? The likelihood is the housekeeper preparing these products, right? It's not your food, it's they're doing the cooking. There's no concern necessarily about it. Maybe she has children, maybe she's the agent of the intermarriage cult, but all things equal, what's the issue? So the Shulchan Aruch says there are those that permit cooking by our non-Jewish maids and those that forbid even after the fact, right? Even after the fact means that if the non-Jewish maid does the cooking, and even if there was no intermarriage attempt, it's cooked, the food is completely not kosher, cannot be eaten by a Jew. All right, so that's how the Shulchan Aruch mentions it. The Ramah, after the fact, you should rely on those that permit. He says, look, if the food is cooked by a non-Jewish maid, you shouldn't throw it out. You're allowed to eat it. Even initially, l'chachila, we are accustomed to be lenient with a Jewish house that has non-Jewish maid servants and men servants that cook in the Jewish house, because inevitably, one of the household members will be doing some stirring. Right? There's a certain, so that's how the Ramah presents it. But he points out that we can be after the fact is okay, and even l'chachila, this idea of having a non-Jewish housekeeper prepare is okay, because inevitably someone does stirring. Now, it doesn't mean someone has to do the stirring. The Ramah seems to carve a lenient lane out in this situation. also mentions something that will be relevant in the next law about what kind of Jewish participation is necessary. So even if there's difficulty in accepting the non-Jewish housekeeper preparing the food, the Ramah does say that stirring the food is enough to have participated in the preparation for the food. But just taking further, this Ramah, who seems to permit the practice of Jewish housekeepers doing the cooking, there's a lot of pushback. Over the generations. The pushback, with regard to Bishul Akum, was significant and harsh. The idea that the interaction between Jew and non-Jew has generally never been a positive one, and so that there was a lot of pushback to permitting the Ramah. Again, it's on the books, and so this might mitigate some of the situation with regards to a non-supervised restaurant, right? If you were able to, if the fact that the non-Jews will here, at least with the housekeeper, what's the rationale? The housekeeper is not leading to a intermarriage situation. Maybe a restaurant doesn't either. We'll see a couple examples in a minute, because especially with regard to bread baked, this idea of commercial bread was extended, that bread baked in a commercial setting is not going to lead to intermarriage, so it was permitted. So that's with regard to the non-Jewish housekeeper. What about how much Jewish participation is needed for it to be considered Jewishly cooked? The use of a Jewish lit oven is sufficient to qualify bread as Bishul Yisrael. However, in other types of cooking, the lighting of the fire nor the lit of the oven hold any significance. It's only the actual act of placing the food in the oven that qualifies as Bishul Yisrael. Therefore, when one wants to cook in a pan in an oven of non-Jews, it is necessary that the Jew puts the pan in himself to a place in the oven that is appropriate to cook it. So the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, is not very happy with just the pilot light. He wants putting the food in the oven. Ramah, and there are those that disagree and believe that lighting a fire or stoking the coal in any way with regards to cooking as with bread is sufficient, and that is our custom. And even stoking the fire with any particular intention works. And there are those that say even if the Jew did not stoke the fire and did not show any wood chips, only the non-Jew lit the oven from a fire that was lit by a Jew, that is permitted. Right? You see, indirect. So the Ramah introduces this leniency. Interestingly enough, many, including Sephardim, pounce on this leniency. And in terms of in the kosher industry, the idea of having a non-Jew having lit the pilot is considered sufficient, because there you have the oven wouldn't work without the pilot. So basically, if the Jew facilitates the oven working, that's enough. Even further, since it only has to be some level of contribution, right? That he talks about throwing in any wood chips. Like what kind of wood chip, throwing in a wood chip when the fire is getting started, does that have on the cooking of the oven? So in the kosher industry, in the kosher supervision industry, because I learned this in the one summer I was filling in for a rabbi supervising a kosher certified dairy restaurant owned by a non-Jew. So this was a concern, and very especially out of town, it's more widely accepted to have less supervision, constant supervision. What they call hashgacha tamidi. Usually, it's mostly in meat restaurants. It's become more standard in dairy restaurants also to have that level of supervision. But how did you ensure the bishul, the cooking was being done by a Jew? There was a light bulb in the oven light. And so basically the oven light, the light bulb was screwed in and the oven light was always left on. And that was kind of a backup should the pilot go out. Now you always had the oven light there. So you had the pilot and you had the bulb. And man, what is the bulb contributing to the cooking process? Yeah, what does a wood chip contribute to the cooking process? So this aspect of to obviate bishul akum, there has been an embrace of the Ramah's approach to eliminate or to minimize the idea of bishul akum, like with the non-Jewish housekeeper. There's been more pushback, but still technically it should be fine if you eliminate the intermarriage concern. So that's the bishul akum, and so I just know that some of these the vegan restaurants that are supervised, that have hashgacha. I know that this is definitely a major thrust of the supervision or the concern of those restaurants. As long as the oven is turned on, you obviated any bishul akum type of an issue, and you're not going to have to be worried about that anymore. There are other issues, as we will see. So let's go back, more into this bishul akum discussion. There have been attempts to be more lenient with the non-Jewish cooking issue from the fact that, as mentioned just a few minutes ago, commercial bread, the rabbis already seem to permit, even in the times of the Talmud. So maybe commercial can be applied also to the cooking, right? What's the difference? Again, if you know the food is kosher, we're not talking, we're not embracing any of the, the more, the deviating standards. The food is all kosher. If it's cooked by a non-Jew without any type of supervision, well, maybe the pilot can obviate that. But maybe even further, you want to push back, because remember, certainly this article is not thinking about supervision altogether. So you have no idea if it's the pilot, the pilot light was lit by a Jew, what level of Jewish participation there may be in the cooking. Is there a way to kind of spread this canopy of commercial food preparation by the non-Jew to be more lenient? So there have been discussions about this in the times of the Rishonim. Source number 7, Rabbi Isaac ben Joseph Halevi, 13th century. A baker bakes in a dedicated space. In such a case, it's not considered including the prohibition of Gentile cooking because fraternization is not relevant. So he's talking about bread, but he recognizes that if the food is being prepared in a set space, separate from the consumer/customer, that's one of the reasons why we can be lenient on commercial bread. So there's this idea introduced in the times of the Rishonim, 13th century, that fraternization is not necessarily, or if you can make fraternization not relevant, then the food prepared by the non-Jew can be, to some extent, mollified, minimized, or the like. Now, the Tur Yoredea, right? So this is Yaakov ben Asher talking. This is pre-Shulchan Aruch, so you're talking, 15th century. He points out that the decree concerning bread did not spread to all places. My father, the Rosh, wrote that is what the great sages who do not prohibit their congregation rely to permit it. Right? It seems that there were plenty of people who were consuming non-Jewishly prepared bread, privately prepared bread, not commercially prepared bread. For they say that these places where the prohibition did not take hold, it didn't catch. And according to my father, the Rosh, there's no distinction between the bread of a homemaker and that of a baker. Right, he says it's not about commercial versus private. There are just some places that bread prepared by a non-Jew was not viewed as prohibited, and could be the rationale provided by the Bedek Habayis. Now, you fast forward to late 19th, 20th century, that pushback that we saw before against the Ramah's leniency of a non-Jewish housekeeper preparing the food is echoed and amplified by the Aruch HaShulchan. Aruch HaShulchan, Yechiel Michal Epstein, source number 9. Cooked foods that were cooked by a non-Jew but were kosher food, nevertheless, the sages forbade them. This is more weighty than bread, of which was explained in the last section. They were lenient about it. And that the decree of bread did not spread throughout all Israel. However, the prohibition of cooked foods did spread throughout Israel. It is not a matter of life-giving as is bread. It's not a staple. Maybe they were lenient because bread is a staple. From its origin, this was prohibited due to intermarriage. So the Aruch HaShulchan is kind of doubling down on bishul akum, food that is prepared by a non-Jew. At the end, though, he says it's because of intermarriage. So is he doubling down that it's always prohibited, or is it prohibition because of intermarriage? And then what do you say when there's no chance of intermarriage, right? You pick up food from someone, you exchange the food, what fraternization is there? Right, I would imagine things were different when they didn't have the same type of restaurant culture that we have today. It was less commercial, it was more personal. But we still see that there is a concern with regard to bishul akum, and that bishul akum, do we separate it from the fraternization or not? So bishul akum is more serious. Maybe you have to obviate the cooking issue, and maybe that can be done by some level of Jewish participation. And or can we just set aside concern for bishul akum because you don't have fraternization? For the most part, right, the more acceptable version is bishul akum needs to be obviated. It can be obviated in a very minimal way, right? It can be obviated in a minimal way that doesn't even eliminate fraternization, right? You got the guy turn the pilot light on, and then maybe you're sitting around with the owner and his, and his daughter and his son, and they're making matches while you sit around the food that isn't technically bishul akum. So the realities have become different. The concerns for Bishul Akum remain in place. The concerns for fraternization may also remain in place. But the Bishul Akum has very much been obviated in a way that seems to have been separated from fraternization. That's on the Bishul Akum issue. Questions or reactions? So we've covered the dairy issue. We've seen there is a thrust to be more permissive with regards to cheese, even if it's not the more widely accepted approach. Definitely not widely accepted. We see the issue of Bishul Akum food prepared by a non-Jew, and that there's certain obviating of that overall prohibition, whether it just be you don't have the fraternization the same way, or the fact that it's very easy to obviate it actually being cooked if you accept the Ramah's leniency, which very much has been the case in kosher restaurants today. What about reliability? All right, let's cut to the heart of the chase. How do you know that a vegan restaurant is serving you vegan food? So I would imagine that there probably was a more innocent, honest time where we thought people would tell the truth, and that does extend even into the realm potentially of food preparation, because the issue emerged. Certain people's business is based on the reliability, right? If the baker doesn't give you bread but gives you something else, and you see source number 10 raises this, the idea of a pharmacist prepares you something that as a medicine and it's not the right thing, there can be serious consequences, physical danger, but then that would ruin the reputation. So the Torah by the Aruch, from the Rashba, right? So going back into the 1300s, I believe. It is possible, one might say that in the source 10, that an order at a Gentile baker or pharmacist is permissible. Since they are artisans and all people buy from them, they designate utensils for their specialty so that their product shall not be tainted by an effusion from their pots. Perhaps that is what has been relied upon for generations to behave on the basis of this permission, although this does not appear correct to me based on the basic Gemara. So the Rashba introduced a situation where you have certain expectations from the proprietor, from the preparer, from the cook, from the pharmacist. And these are also not just kind of basic products, these are specialty items, they're cooking things. So basically you rely on the fact that they're not going to want anything to go wrong, including with using the right pot. So therefore, there may be a basis to permit it, even though he disagrees. He says this makes sense, but we don't really have the sources to back this up. But if you would apply this, let's say, to a vegan restaurant, there are certain, vegan restaurants are specialty items that are prepared a certain way, and that maybe there can be some reliability. If you're going to market yourself as vegan, you're not going to stay in business very long if it turns out you're serving chicken. So you're not going to, if it tastes like chicken, you're not going to survive very long. Maybe there's that approach. Now remember, it makes sense, but how did the Rashba conclude? The Gemara doesn't say so. We see something similar in the Shulchan Aruch, also in terms of it making sense but not relying upon it, where he quotes this halacha. He quotes the pharmacists or the artisans. You can rely upon them because they specify miyachadim kelim nikiyim l'malachtam kedei shelo yifku u'menotam. Right. Remember, we're talking about this concern getting us into the issue. What about non-kosher pans? Right. You have a non-kosher pan. On some level, non-kosher pan after 24 hours loses some of its non-kosher status. But how could you be sure that he won't be bringing in pans off off the street? One gets ruined, bring in another one. It's not kosher. They just use the same pan in the restaurant next door to cook pork chops. He brings it in to cook as vegan. So the Shulchan Aruch embraces or echoes the logic of the Rashba and says they're not going to do that. They don't want to use tainted pans if this is their specialty. They're not going to do that. Okay, it makes sense, but he concludes, Uval nefesh yachush devarim elam avin lidei taru nikiyos. You got to be careful. From a spiritual perspective, you have to be concerned. This is not just about the technicality. This is about the soul of the matter as well. A person who's spiritually sensitive, Val nefesh, can't necessarily rely upon this. And that's certainly the case if you don't necessarily, the reliability isn't about dishonesty, but it's just about industry standards. Arlene Mathis Sharf is a scientist specializing in food science. number of articles for different places. It's actually kashrut.com, not kaharut.com. She has an article on vegan, vegetarian, kosher, source number 12. There are no official standards for a product to be labeled vegan or vegetarian, unlike kosher or USDA organic. Beef, pork, and chicken are not considered to be allergens, so there's no requirement for companies to list any residue or the presence of these or any other non-allergens that might find their way into a product. Processing equipment that is needed to produce a good product is expensive. The easiest and cheapest way to make products is an existing factory. Many times, the non-meat equivalent of a meat product uses existing meat equipment to make the meatless product. Same goes for many non-dairy milk products. It's easier to make them in a dairy plant. So you have, it's very hard to have something that's vegan. And there are a number of different standards out there, and you can look it up. And the certifications don't necessarily seem to indicate that you can be so sure. So yes, someone can, these are not necessarily the artisans and pharmacists of the Rashba and the Shulchan Aruch. These are business people who are having vegan, and maybe they're doing the very best that they can. But the very best that they can isn't necessarily enough to rise to the standard of halacha. Rav Moshe Feinstein presents that the real standard is there has to be financial penalties to pay. If it hits them in the wallet, then you can rely upon them. And he says, this is source number 13, Ubadavar lahamin hakompanies alma shenosnim besocha machalim sheosim. Right? Can you believe a company to say that what's in the product is the product? Im yishchayvu onesh kishemishakrim, if they're going to have to pay if they lie, yesh lismachalem mishum demirsas, that it creates enough of a fear, incentive out of fear. V'im ein onesh einem manim, if they're not going to be punished, it's not going to be, you can't trust them. So, there are certain standards that go into food labeling and the like, but then there are certain loopholes. And especially when it comes to vegan, when there's no one ironclad definition. And, so unless there will be a financial penalty, you can't necessarily believe. Now, some of you may be thinking along the lines of this relates to Rav Moshe Feinstein's discussion about milk, right? There's a discussion in one of the products that you have to, that you can't rely upon a non-Jew is milk. It was in source number 4. So what about the milk that we drink? That a Jew did not see him performing the milking action. That's technically a problem. Remember, Moshe Feinstein said that the USDA or the Dairy Association, the FDA, everyone today, milk. The only thing that can be labeled milk is cow's milk, and there are penalties to pay, and there are concerns. So therefore, the milk that we have today in America is halachically Chalav Yisrael, or qualifies as Chalav Yisrael because of the fact that you can believe them, what they're calling milk is milk because of the potential for financial penalty. Not everyone agrees. So people think that maybe it is, like we said before, spiritually sensitive people can be machmir, can be stringent on Chalav Yisrael. But that essentially, what Rav Moshe Feinstein is mentioning here in terms of trusting the companies is what we apply to milk. So what kind of penalties? Let's say it's not would they go out of business if it turns out that they're serving the wrong type of vegan product? Is their reputation that much on the line? Doesn't seem not so clear. So can you just trust them? Without there are people that halacha says we could trust. It's just a question of, can you trust the proprietor of a vegan restaurant without any other follow-up checking? And that Sharf gives an example of a major, potential pitfall. Example of the fact that the admixture of items can become difficult is 2 major brands plant-based raw chicken strips. One brand is certified kosher and one brand is non-kosher. It is likely, again, she's not saying I know this, but it is likely that for the non-certified product, the food company is sending the raw product to a plant that makes chicken nuggets from chicken. Nevertheless, the final product is able to be called vegan, but it's certainly not kosher, much less parov. It may even have been fried in the same oil as the chicken products. For the kosher certified product, the food company either keeps the frying in the house, sends the product to a kosher factory, or has the chicken fryer equipment koshered before use. A non-kosher certified vegan restaurant could use either product. In addition, many food products contain added flavors. Vegans do not care about a small amount of animal-based chemicals and flavors, so there are vegan certified ice creams that contain dairy flavors. Another kosher issue with vegan products is the use of non-kosher grape juice. That's an issue with the vinegar also in terms of wine vinegar. Just as a footnote, we're talking about the conservative movements efforts here. Conservative movement previously, just like they talked about cheese and dairy previously, back in the 60s, 70s, had much more permissible understanding of non-kosher wine and grape juice. So it's kind of their response to these types of concerns is they're no longer worried about that. That's not really halachically valid, but just to keep it within the context of this headline for the week. So there are plenty of issues. The idea that your vegan chicken nuggets could be fleischiks, can be tray fleischiks, is a possibility. So how is this obviated? Supervision. Right. It doesn't necessarily require significant supervision. Right? I'm not saying that these are the standards of the OU and the OK, but there are ways to work with proprietors and their suppliers. Right. This day and age, it's not like someone's going to the supermarket and putting things in a shopping cart. You're ordering from these major food restaurant providers, and you can see the order forms, you can see the invoices, and a mashgiach can take a look at what's in the pantry. Right? It doesn't require huge amounts of supervision. The idea is just to raise this to a level that there's some reliability of what's coming in. And with zero oversight, the Sharf gives us some of the pitfalls that really are showing non-kosher food being consumed in a vegan restaurant. Now, another thing that has to come up, and we were alluded to with regards to before, this idea of what about the fact that if it's already b'diavad or batel, right? Certain things we shouldn't engage in, but what happens if they already were done? Is there any type of leniency? And batel is a very big deal. This idea of nullification. So for example, like if you have, let's say, so the case comes up, you have all this kosher meat and some non-kosher meat gets mixed into it. It's batel. It's batel so far, like, let's say you have 10 pieces of meat, that some of them are not kosher. 3 of them are not kosher, 7 are kosher. There is a view that you can eat all 10 pieces of meat. Right? That's Rabbi Forst in his Laws of Kashrus points out in source 15. The Rosh, who takes a more lenient, radically different view, in his opinion, Bittul Baro brings about the complete transformation of the non-kosher food into kosher food. The non-kosher food has been nullified, it's completely lost its identity. Therefore, the entire mixture may be eaten by one person even at once. Right? The more accepted practice is we don't let one person eat all 10 pieces of meat because they're definitely eating non-kosher. But this idea of bittul is in some ways kind of a magic formula that allows us to, find some leniency. So, maybe that can be employed here too. That we know that most of the food is going to be vegan, and maybe the minority that isn't, we can be batel barov, and we can take the most lenient version of batel barov. So the Shach points out where there is an incontrovertible sfeika, when there's a double doubt, one does not need to do any checking, even though it would be possible to clarify the status of the prohibition through inquiry. It's kind of interesting that if you're not sure exactly where the food is, but most of the time the food is vegan, and then you're not sure if they, which pot they use. If you have a double doubt, then just give up. Some would say. However, some disagree. One should be strict to undertake inquiry where it is possible, and nothing would be lost. Right? This idea of completely, wiping our hands, washing our hands of any responsibility to investigate, is not really the accepted halachic approach. Once again, there are those that say, and those that say, and this idea of saying vegan and vegetarian doesn't require supervision is holding on to all of those that say, ignoring some very accessible opportunities to do the due diligence and the supervision that's required. Not onerous, but ways that, as the Shach says, undertake some inquiry where it is possible and nothing would be lost. And so that is, further reason why we don't just say we rely on what was already done or any possible bittul. We should do the level of investigation that's needed. And the truth is, I think there are ways to supervise that don't necessarily have a certain type of onerous level, that's a supervision that stands in the national, kashrus organizations, that can still be kosher. But to wipe away any responsibility to check is not within what keeping kosher is all about. Does halacha demand that we do the absolute best all the time? No, we can choose to do the absolute best all the time, but we are obligated to do a certain amount of minimum to ensure that halachic issues have been addressed. And there's certainly ways to supervise vegan restaurants in more manageable ways that then might be required by some organizations that could still maintain it. Also, the question becomes, how necessary is it? Especially moving away from the just halachic issues. If you have dozens of supervised vegan restaurants, to specifically go to one that's not supervised and rely upon this type of reasoning, certainly seems to not meeting the threshold for doing some due diligence and trying to keep kosher. So I think that's also part of it. Questions, comments, reactions?
So where is a vegan restaurant that's highly supervised? I am more confused now than I was before.
I don't know. You got to check your restaurant list. I'm not really familiar. Vegan isn't really my thing.
Yeah.
But again, look, I will only say anecdotally, having passed vegan restaurants which have supervisions which are not nationally recognized, there are plenty of Jewish-looking people there. I think that there's a certain socially acceptable approach to eat in kosher certified restaurants, even if those kosher certifications wouldn't necessarily be the ones you bring into your home. I think it's just the way people respond, maybe specifically to vegan, that if it's certified kosher, we'll go in there. And that probably just led to more people going in there, because, hey, look, the Jews are using it. I sometimes find it interesting that, places that I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to go to or endorse, but they'll be like, yeah, but look at all those Jews who were there. They'll sometimes take the visible traffic. There are all those black cats eating there. How come we can't go? But I think that's more on the social aspect of kosher than on the halachic. But then again, it is not so hard to give supervision to a vegan restaurant, and I think that, again, I don't know all of the names and all these certificates. I've encountered a few of them. They try to cover the issues. What were we talking about? Okay, so you can't have it. We're not going to be lenient on dairy, so it's only vegan. Bishul Akum, you got the pilot light covered. You want to make sure. You want to make sure that the products are good, so you have to have a mechanism system in place to make sure that the products are properly vetted. You want the same thing with how mistakes are handled or the vessels, so maybe they kosher them in advance. I mean, it's not that hard to cover the baseline of these laws with, again, not going into the politics and policies of national organizations, which have other calculations in mind when they do this. So, if anyone knows about an OU certified vegan restaurant, let Rosie know.
Hi. I always find it interesting when a gzeira is issued by the rabbis, and it takes a life of its own, and it exists by itself, and the reason for the gzeira is sometimes ignored. And I mean, I find this. I was thinking about that when you're talking about the Bishul Akum issue of a housekeeper. So we're worried about turning on the pilot light, turning on the light yourself, all those things. But, that's a very technical solution to the Bishul Akum problem. The underlying issue of, fraternization or maybe even worrying about kashrus of what they cook is kind of pushed aside. But then it's sort of included by others saying, well, we don't have to worry about it. I was just always found it a very interesting topic to consider.
Look, in general, we don't like to usually ascribe, we don't like to find reasons for laws, and then when the reason changes, the law changes. And particularly when it comes to the Jew's relationship with the non-Jew, there really hasn't been a very extended period of time where Jewish law would develop around a good relationship between Jews and non-Jews. And whether that be civil, whether political, whether it be government's oppressive, for the most part, halacha didn't develop in ways that could see some of these changes. And so this idea of intermarriage because you're eating in a restaurant where the non-Jew turned on the pilot light, we never had a shot at developing anything like that. Look, the conservative movement very much is responding to historical times. They don't see this as an issue, so they'll grab onto the changing reality. You should change the halacha. there are other ways to address the halachic issues, and we see that some of this was on the mind of people previously, but it's it's definitely I don't especially if we normalize the Ramah Bishalakim, we can get rid of. Right, because you just have the Jew responsible for the pile. You have a mechanism that this Jewish participation. Then you're talking more about products and the leniencies and liberties that they're willing to take in products and in bittul and in trust extend a little bit more, especially in the vegan conception of things, which really has a lot of pitfalls. Vegan can be, you can call it anything, and it might not. You can call it vegan, it's not vegan, and it has treif influence also. So it's there. It gets a little bit more complicated. I guess b'tei avon everybody.